All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, my name is Stephen Walther, and I'm going to be here talking today about the new features in ASP.NET MVC 2. So how many of you are using MVC right now? Basically, everyone. That's good. All right, so let me start by saying a little bit about our goals with MVC 1, and then I'll explain how we've done more to reach these goals with the new features that we've added into the MVC 2 framework. So before working at Microsoft, I worked for many, many years as a consultant. And how many of you work as consultants right now? Yeah, so you know the life. So as a consultant, you go in, you work with companies. My life always started very, very easy. I'd always be called into a company and they say, oh, we have something really, really simple we need to implement. It's like a single button application. It will take you can do it like 2 hours and you'll be done. And that's how things would start. But as you all know, as soon as you finish, that super simple one button application, it becomes this thing right here, right? So immediately everything becomes much more complex. One of the things that you learn quickly is the initial application that you build when you're working for a company, you typically don't put the most work into just kind of getting that first application out there. What you learn over time is the majority of your work goes into maintaining an existing application, fixing bugs in it, extending it with new features. That's where your work really starts after you have the initial application completed. So one of our goals with MVC was to allow you to build applications that can be easily maintained over the long term. So it's all very easy to build an application that you can it's all very easy to write an application once quickly that works for one day, for one single fantastic day. But the real question is, can you build an application that will not only work today, but also that you feel comfortable changing for new features for tomorrow, fixing bugs, and maintaining over time. So that's the challenge that MVC helps you to address. MVC 1 does that through a clear separation of concerns. So everything's divided into model view controller. It follows good software design patterns. So it allows you to create maintainable applications. MVC 1 also did that through testability. Some people like to use test-first development, to use test-driven development. Some people like to just the fact that MVC allows you to build unit tests at all, to allow you to check for regressions in your code. Every feature in MVC was designed to be testable. I attended all those meetings, all the feature design meetings, where the discussion, whenever a new feature came up, how would we go about testing it? So everything from the ground up was designed with testability in mind. And finally, MVC was designed to steer away from high-level abstractions. MVC was designed to appeal to people who want to work close to the metal. In other words, people are comfortable working directly with HTML, working directly with CSS and JavaScript, and they don't want anything in their way. They don't want high-level abstractions like view state to get in the way of working directly with their HTML. They want to do all that stuff themselves. So that's why we have the MVC framework that we have today that we all know and love. So what's new in MVC 2? What have we been working on since the initial release? Well, there's 3 main areas. Again, we don't want to change any of the good qualities of MVC 1, but the 2 main things that we wanted to do was, first, we wanted to make everything even more maintainable. We wanted to extend the maintainability story. But the other thing we wanted to do is we want to allow you to be more productive when building MVC applications. We want you to be able to get more stuff done in a briefer amount of time and still build applications that that you can be proud of. Build applications that are maintainable, that follow good software design patterns. So I'm going to be talking about 3 main buckets of features today. The first bucket has to do with providing a better separation of concerns. So one thing we did is we added a render action method that allows you to separate out some of your business logic out of your controllers in a more maintainable way. I'm also going to be talking, this is really one of my favorite new features of MVC 2, areas. Areas gives you a way to create sub-applications within an MVC application, so it allows you to manage large projects, or even relatively medium-sized projects as well. Areas is a really nice feature for dividing up the functionality in your MVC application. Another area where we've worked a lot is around validation. So we want to do validation the right way, so it's all model-driven, but we automatically support validation on the server side, and we also now allow you to bubble up all the validation rules to the client side, so you get automatic client validation from your server-side models. And finally, I want to talk about the helper improvements that we've added into MVC2. Two main areas: we've added strongly typed helpers, and we've also added templated helpers. So the templated helpers allow you to be very productive because they allow you to automatically generate UI for entities within your MVC application. So let's start with, well, actually, before I start talking about the new render action stuff, I should mention that ASP.NET MVC 2 works with, of course, both Visual Studio 2010 and Visual Studio 2008. Should emphasize that it's always compiled against 3.5. So MVC 2 is a 3.5 assembly, but you can use it within 2010. And it's completely, and it will be included with Visual Studio 2010 when it's actually released at RTM, which is, March 22nd. So it's actually going to be integrated with, it's going to be shipped with Visual Studio 2010, but if you don't have to use Visual Studio 2010 to use it, because you can still download it separately and use it with Visual Studio 2008. All right, so let's start talking about the new features. I want to start by talking about the render action feature. Now, this is one of those features that people were constantly asking for MVC1. We delayed introducing it in MVC1 because we wanted to make sure that we could implement it in the right way. And so now we've actually added it in. Well, the idea between the render action method is it gives you a way to separate out certain logic out of your controllers that isn't controller specific. So using render action makes sense if you're showing, say, a menu that you want to show on multiple pages, and there's some business logic behind it. You're going to want to call render action to do it. Showing banner ads, shopping carts, that kind of thing is great for render action. If you've been working with MVC1, you're probably very used to render partial. The difference between render partial and render action is all that render partial does is it renders a user control, and that's it. So it just splats out some UI. If you need some business logic behind your UI, then you need to use the new render action method, because that actually allows you to invoke a controller action, and then the controller action can generate different views, and that's what you show in a page. So it's much more, if you have business logic, then go ahead and make sure you use render action. So let me show you a demonstration of using the new render action method. I want to start by showing you the challenge that you run into without using render action. I have a website here. I admit it's not the most beautiful website. I'm not a designer. Show you what it looks like. There we go. So that is my simple MVC website. Let's say I want to show a banner ad on every page. Typically, the logic for displaying a banner ad is complicated, right? You want different weightings. You need a lot of different business logic behind it. If I hit refresh, it's going to show different banner ads for me. Isn't that nice? But this is the type of thing that you would want to include in multiple views within an MVC application. So the challenge here is, well, how do you do that? How do you invoke the same logic within multiple controller actions and do that in a maintainable manner? So let's take a look at the way that you might go about doing it using MVC1. In MVC1, you really had a choice here. One thing you can do, this is the home controller for my MVC application. One thing that you could do is, if you always knew that you had to execute that logic, you could put in the actual constructor for a controller, but that means that you're now committing to using it for every action that you're calling on the controller, which wouldn't necessarily be true. And in this case, I've actually, this is controller relative now. If there's other controllers that want to show the same thing, I'd have to come up with like a base class or something. So things start to get more complicated there. So not the best solution. So you can do it in MVC1. An alternative way, which I think would be even worse, is you could call a method from each of your controller actions that calls out to the logic that you need to generate the advertisement, and then you put it into the view data just for, for each particular action. In that case, you'd have to remember to call that additional logic for each controller action. Again, not a very maintainable solution. So the idea of the render action method, let's go to the second home controller. So notice in this home controller, there's no logic at all that has anything to do with showing banner ads. all that logic has been moved out. It's been moved out into a separate controller devoted exclusively to showing advertisements, this advertisement controller. And this has my, admittedly not super complicated logic for displaying banner ads. Actually, I have an ad repository, so I'm hiding that super complicated logic. But what it's doing is it's returning the particular ad that you want to show. Now, the nice thing is I can actually call this method right here. I can call the advertisement controller and call the get method within my views right here. And so what that allows me to do is invoke in this case, the get action on the advertisement controller, and it can execute whatever logic I need it to do, and it will return the partial and display it on the page. So it gives you a way to create something very much like subcontrollers, right? It gives you a way to be able to run business logic when you're showing UI. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. All right, so let's talk about the next feature. So I mentioned before, this is one of my favorite areas. The reason it's one of my favorite areas is this gives you a good way to divide up even a medium-sized application into multiple, well, again, it's hard to get away from that word areas, into different groups of functionality so it's more maintainable over time. So one of the nice things about this new feature is it has really great tooling support. I'm going to show you that in a moment. Let me go ahead and demonstrate how you do it. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a new instance of Visual Studio for this. I'm going to create a new project. Oops, I actually want to create an MVC2 web application. One thing, by the way, since we're actually at this dialogue, I should emphasize that there's nothing wrong with running MVC2 side by side with MVC1. You can go ahead and have both MVC1 and MVC2 running on the same machine at the same time if you want to play with both technologies at the same time. Okay, so I'm creating a new MVC2 application called My Areas. Oh, and while I'm here, I should mention, notice that you have a new empty web application. So so instead of having to start every time now with the home controller and all that stuff, you can start with an empty project. That was one of the things that a lot of customers asked for because they wanted to start from scratch without the default stuff inside of it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create the project. Always want to create my unit tests. And nothing fancy so far. This is just a standard MVC application. Now, in most applications that I build in real life, I end up creating, some admin pages, right? Some administrative pages to control things in the background. So this is a nice place to take advantage of the new area feature, because what areas will allow me to do is take all that logic and put it into a sub-application of my main MVC application. So let me show you how that works. I'm going to go ahead and right-click and go to Add Area. Isn't that nice? It's just you get this nice, just menu option for doing it. Boom. I want to give a name for the area. I'm going to call it admin. And notice what I get. So I get a new subfolder called areas, this guy right here. And inside of that subfolder, I get an admin subfolder. And if you look inside of it, it looks just like a standard MVC application, right? It has a controllers folder, a views folder, all this models folder, all the standard stuff that you get inside of an MVC application, you get right in the area. Now, of course, you can add as many areas as you want here if you want to divide it up. So if I was creating like a store application, I might create like a blog area. I might create I might create a marketing area. Whatever I want to do, anytime it makes sense to divide up the functionality, I can go ahead and create the separate areas. So let me go ahead. I'm going to add a new controller inside of my area. So I created a new controller called Market Controller inside of it. And I have an index action. I'm going to go ahead and add a view onto it. I'll just create an index view. That way we'll have something to look at. And I'll just go ahead and make sure I name it Market Index so we know which index we're looking at. All right, so let me go ahead and show you how this works. Just a warning, this won't work, but I'm going to go ahead and run it because this is as a warning to you when you try to get this to work later on, so you can turn around and thank me for saving you some time figuring this new feature out. I'm going to go ahead and run this. And it's going to go to the standard home controller right now. Now I'm going to go to my admin market controller. Let's just be explicit. Let's put it all out. And it can't find anything. So I know this is the right URL. It's just not finding it. So there's one more step that you have to do that's important to remember whenever you take advantage of areas. There's one more thing you have to do in the configuration file. By default, the routes that you defined in areas, and each separate area can have its own set of routes, they have to be pulled into this global.asax file. You have to actually register all of them so that it knows. Now, the reason that we make you go through this extra step isn't because we're cruel and we're trying to make life difficult for our developers. The reason we do this is for performance reasons. We don't want to assume that you're using areas because you might not be. And so we don't want to iterate through all the assemblies and figure it out unless there's a good reason to do it. So for performance reasons, we require you to do one extra step. Let me show you how it works. Actually, before I go to the global.asax file to register all the areas, I do want to point out, actually let me get rid of that thing right there. I do want to point out that whenever you create an area, you get this area registration file right here. And if you look inside of it, you'll notice that it has its own routes inside of it right here. So each area can have its own routing information. So it could all be divided up there. Now the problem is right now, this routing information isn't bubbled up to the parent application. The parent application doesn't know anything about it. So I need to do one more thing. I need to go to the global.asax file. I need to add area registration.register all areas. And now this will go through all of those all those .cs files, all the area registration files, and pull in all the routes so the area will work. So let's go ahead and run that. Okay, so it's going to go to the home controller index page first. Now I'm going to go to admin market index, and notice that we got now to our own view. So we actually got to the subview inside the area in the little mini application, and all that stuff worked. Does it make sense? Fantastic. All right, so whenever I see a new feature like this, I immediately want to try to figure out how I can break it. I don't know, it's just some perversity I have. But one thing when I first saw this feature is I was thinking, well, what would happen if I created another home controller in a sub area? I mean, the parent folder has a home controller. Could you have duplications of controller names? Is that going to work? So let me go ahead and show you what's going to happen if you do that. I'm going to add a new controller into my admin area. I'm going to call it home controller. And let's go ahead and associate a view with this. So I'm going to call it admin home index. And let's see what happens. Okay. And boom. Okay, so don't worry, we'll fix this in a moment, but it actually gives a really intuitive error message, right? It's complaining because we now have two home controllers, and justifiably it's upset. The MVC framework is upset because there's an ambiguity now about what we mean by a home controller. So the fix here, it's a really easy fix. All we need to do to get this to work is we need to be explicit about the namespaces associated with each of the different areas. So we can do that by making one more change to the global.asax file. So I didn't actually know that the MVC framework supported this feature until I started working with areas. But when you define a route, and that's what I'm doing right here, you can actually add an additional parameter for the route. And what this additional parameter enables you to do is specify the assembly namespaces, or specify the namespaces where we'll look for controller action that matches the route. So this can be an array here. This is a string array. I'm just going to go ahead and put one inside of it. My application is called My Areas, and I only want it to look for controllers for the parent area. So that way, there won't be ambiguity anymore about what I mean by the home controller action. There. Let's go ahead and run this. Isn't that nice? So this is working fine now for the home controller, right? So this is going to the standard parent application home controller. But now I can also go to admin, home, index. Let's be really explicit about it. And that one works too. Notice it's actually going to a separate home controller. So that all works. You can have naming collisions for controller actions, or actually for controllers in different areas. And as long as you're careful about namespacing everything, there's no problem. You just have to make sure that the framework can figure out what you're talking about, which seems like a fair deal to me. All right. Any questions about areas before I move on? All right. So next thing I want to talk about is validation. So we've done a lot of work to make it a lot easier for you to implement validation in an ASP.NET MVC application. And we wanted to do this in the right way. Remember, our whole goal here is to make you fall into the pit of maintainability success, right? So everything we've done is designed around allowing you to build applications that are maintainable over time. Now, the right way to do validation inside of an application is at the level of the model, right? Or at least, at some degree at the business logic level, because you don't want to do all your validation rules just on, say, client side or inside your views, for several different reasons. One reason is it just makes it hard to maintain it because every time you need to work with the same entity across multiple views, you have to re-implement all your validation rules. So the way everything works is you define your validation rules inside of your model class, and then those validation rules automatically bubble up to do server-side validation. So there's now the default model binder uses the data annotations validations or other validation methods. It's all extensible. I'll show you that in a moment. And then, this is where things get really cool. And then after it goes to the server side, it will automatically bubble up to the client side. So you automatically get client and server validation based on just setting the right attributes or setting up your validation rules on your model classes. All the rest of the stuff just works automatically, which is the way you want to do validation. So we have a provider notion now for validation because we didn't want to force you to use only one type of validation. This is a thing that, like most things in the MVC world, developers get very passionate about the right way to do validation. So we wanted to support different models for doing it. Out of the box, we support using the data annotation validators. If you've used .NET RIA services or you've used dynamic data, you've probably used the data annotation validators before. There's standard things, like required validator and things like that. So that's what we use by default. But this is a provider model, so if you want to, you could use the enterprise library, the validation application block. You can go ahead and use that as a provider, or anything you want. You can put your validation rules inside of a database table and pull it in. We don't care. We've just provided you with the interfaces. You can write to those interfaces in the way that you want. The easiest way out of the box is just to use the data annotation stuff. So again, data annotation validators, really it's a simple set of validators. You get required field range validators, so you get basic validators. The nice thing is it's very extensible. So there's a base validator attribute. You can go ahead and extend that and create different types of custom validation to be able to add into your application. The way that you use these attributes is you can go ahead and just mark up a class with them. So in this case, I have a customer class. Let's say that I want to make the first name for the customer required. All I'd have to do is put in a required attribute. You notice I also have a display name attribute there. That's because you probably don't want to show first name all scrunched together as in an error message, right? Because that kind of looks cheesy, like a machine generated it. So what you could do is with the display name attribute is you can change the name of the property. It's going to default to using the property name in error messages. Using display name, you can do anything you want. Or actually, the error message, there's an error message property on all the validators they can use to completely customize the validation error message if you want to. I'm also using a really simple regular expression validator. Probably too simple to use in a production application, but just to make sure that the email at least in general, looks like an email address. So that's the basic idea behind the data annotation validators. Now, there are some complications in using these in real life. And I want to show you, it's not actually that big of a deal, but if you're building an MVC application, you're going to be generating your model classes using an object relational mapper tool. So you'll use, link to SQL, you'll use ND framework, you'll use Hibernate, whatever. You'll use some sort of tool to generate all your basic entity classes. And because you're using a tool to generate the entity classes, you can't assign these data annotation validators directly onto the model classes. So typically, what you want to do in that scenario is create something called buddy classes, and then that way you can associate the right annotations with the right classes. That's something really simple to do, so I'm just going to show you. There we go. All right, so this application has a movie database, contains a list of movies inside of it. I've created a model class using the ND framework right here. And so if this, using the ND framework or link to SQL or whatever, this automatically generates a movie class for me. And if I look actually in the source code, I'd see the movie class. I can't add the data annotation validators there because next time I'd run the tool, it would just stomp on the class and I'd lose whatever data annotations I use. So what I want to do instead is I want to create a partial class. So I've created my own movie partial class. You'll notice it is a partial class. And this partial class has nothing inside of it right now. And the reason for that is I'm using this meta type attribute to associate a metadata class with the partial class. So if you look down here, this is my actual buddy class right here, movie underscore metadata. So if I can go ahead and mark up this class with my data annotation validators. So if I want to make title required, I can just go ahead and say required. I can customize the error message. Put something here, please. And director, let's go ahead and use like the string length validator. And I'm saying that the director name needs to be, well, the maximum length can be 4 characters. All right, so that's all I have to do for validation. And this will now bubble up to the server side because now the default model binder is uses data annotations in the background. So I've created this guy. I don't have to make any changes to my controllers, to my views, anything. All I have to do is run it. Here's my list of movies. I'm going to go ahead and say create new. Click create. There we go. I got my custom error message right here. I'm going to put in something for director that's too long. And it automatically generates this error message right here. So I get all my validation automatically and for free. That's pretty nice. Now, before anyone objects to the fact that they don't want to use the data annotation validators, I actually kind of like the data annotation validators, but we're not forcing you to use that particular type of validation if you don't want to. I know a lot of you like to use, for example, the enterprise library validation block. Remember, this is all provider-based, so you can go ahead and swap in any type of backend validation that you want. You can even create, static validation rules in code and use that as well. We don't care as long as you get the data in the right place and implement the right interface. Now, so far, what I've shown you is just server-side validation, right? Everything happening here is happening on the server side. The other thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to support client-side validation. Why make people wait? Why make people have to go to, do a postback just to see validation messages? So what we've done is we've created a library. We've created a client-side validation library. And if you want to enable client-side validation, you just need to do 2 things. It's disabled by default. To enable it, you have to add 2 scripts into your page, typically, and you stick these in your master page so they can be cached and used across all your pages. You have to do 1 helper method call. You have to call html.enableClientValidation, and that's it. That's all you have to do. You don't have to write a line of JavaScript. Everything happens for you magically in the background. Everything's generated for you. So let me show you how that works. I'm going to go back to the application that we were just working with. And let me go to the create view. This guy right here. And right now, this has no scripts inside of it whatsoever. I'm not calling the helper method. So the only thing I have to do to get all this to work is I'm going to go to my scripts folder. And I'm going to go ahead and pull out Microsoft AJAX debug, Microsoft AJAX library, now known as the ASP.NET AJAX library. Stick that there. And now I'm going to also pull out Microsoft MVC AJAX debug. Those are the two scripts that I need. Again, normally you put these in a master page. And then I have to call one more helper method. Boom, I'm done. Oops. This is actually a method call, right? I'm not displaying something. That's better. All right, so let's go ahead and run this. I'm going to create a new movie. I'm going to try to submit without putting anything at all. And now I'm going to type something into the title field. Now this wouldn't have worked before. Before we only had server-side validation. But now, by just calling that method and putting those scripts in, now if I type something in here and I hit tab, notice it goes away. Ooh. But the ooh part of that really should be because this is, unlike web forms where you would have to actually create a separate required field validator and make sure that you put that inside the form. In this case, you've only defined your validation rules once. You defined them once on the server side, and they've bubbled up all the way to the client side automatically. Okay. All right, last thing I want to talk about are improvements to helpers. First thing we did was we knew a lot of you wanted strongly typed helpers. So we had some of those in futures before. Now we're putting them in the main framework. So the idea of strongly typed helpers is if you're doing, how many of you are using ReSharper, just out of curiosity? Yeah. So I would say, I don't know, 50%, something like that. So a lot of people are using ReSharper. So a lot of people who work with MVC love the ReSharper tool and love refactoring tools in general because you want to be able to refactor quickly to improve the overall architecture of your application. The problem if you're not using strongly typed helpers, if you're just using something like HTML.textbox, it's really hard to refactor stuff quickly because you end up using strings to refer to everything that you want to display. Strings aren't very refactorable. So the nice thing is, if you're using the strongly typed helpers, they all end with 4. You can go ahead and instead of passing in a string to represent a value, you can go ahead and use a lambda expression, and the lambda expression is highly refactorable. So, so we support that now. The other area where we've made a lot of investments is in templated helpers. Now, if you've worked with dynamic data, then you're going to be very familiar with this idea of templates. The idea is we've supported a lot of different ways to use templates, but the idea is that you can, instead of having to write out the views for everything, we default to certain ways for displaying the views. So we have, dynamic templates for inside of MVC for making it easier to quickly display entities in your application. So there's 3 display helper methods. The one I'm going to the 3 display methods allow you to actually show in a read-only way an entity or a property. There's also 3 editor helper methods, and that's for creating an insert form or an edit form. So let me go ahead and show you how these work. Let's start with, well, actually, I should mention, so the way that the way that a template is used depends on what you're showing. But the simplest way to use a template is you can create a template for any type in the .NET framework, for example, like a date-time type. And that way, whenever you show a property of that type, it will automatically show the corresponding template. The obvious example is date-time. I'll show you an example of that in a moment where I show a date picker whenever you show a date-time property inside of your application. You can do that. You can also be explicit about your templates. So you can tell it, when you call the helper method, you can say by name which template to use. And then finally, if you're using the data annotation stuff, there's a UI hint that you can use. This only works at the property level. It doesn't work at the entity level. But you can say which template to use to display a particular property. OK, so I I think I have a demo for that. I'll get to the fallback thing in a moment. See, here we go. All right, so let me go ahead and run this first, and I'll show you what it does. So we're going to start with this view here. Again, I'm back to the movie database, so I have a movie class. And so far, I haven't actually defined any templates at all. And up there at the top, this is what's being displayed if you're using the display model 4 template, and the one on the bottom is the edit model 4 template. So this is the default rendering you get if you're just using display model. So what it does is it shows the name of the property, the value, and there's some nice CSS in the background, so you can actually use some CSS to make this look nicer. And then it just shows a bunch of HTML text boxes. Now it is smart about these things. It will use things like checkboxes for Boolean values, so it does have a little bit of intelligence here, but it's a pretty basic template that you get by default, where the expectation is that you'll want to customize the template. So let me show you the actual page that I used, the actual view that I used to do that. So to get the read-only display of the data, I called HTML display for model. And since in this case the model class being passed to this view is a movie class, it automatically displayed everything in read-only mode. And again, HTML editor for model automatically create those text boxes off of it. Okay, so it's a very basic template. If I want to customize the template, what I can do is I can go ahead and define my own template, and this is just a partial. Notice inside of it. And the model being passed to this partial represents the model that I'm going to customize the template for. And then inside of my view, I can go ahead and just pass explicitly the name of the template that I want to use. So now I can go ahead and customize the display of the movie. Let me go ahead and show you that. So again, this isn't super fancy, but this doesn't look like the default read-only template anymore. And this guy doesn't look like the default edit template anymore. I've customized the appearance of it by creating my own partials for each of those different templates. Now, if you actually look at the folder structure here, you'll notice that I actually have a display templates subfolder that contains all the templates for displaying things. And then there's an edit templates subfolder that contains all the templates for editing things. All right, the third example I want to show you is, I want to show you how you can specify a template by data type. Now I mentioned before that you could do things like, I'd create a date time template, and that's going to apply to anything that's a date time property. I could create a Boolean template, whatever I want to do, and customize the appearance of a particular type of property. Now in this case, I couldn't help myself. We just released the ASP.NET AJAX library, so I want to go ahead and use the calendar AJAX control toolkit control, which now works perfectly fine inside of MVC. And I've put that inside the template so that when you click on release date, you actually get a calendar pop up. So you can go ahead and pick the release date like that. Now the way that I was able to implement that, let's look at the date time template right here, is inside of this template, I just called sys.create to create the calendar and use that template to be able to customize this input element. So now whenever I show a date time anywhere in my application, I'll get the pop-up calendar displaying for me. Really simple. So the last thing I want to show you with templates, our templates actually support something called fallover. Now let me explain how that works. So the idea is, remember that you can specify a template by type. So I can go ahead and apply, I could create, for example, an employee template, an employee.asax file, and that's going to be used whenever I show any employee class, when I use the helper method to display an employee class. Now the templating framework is actually smart enough to understand the inheritance hierarchies of classes. So what it'll do is, in this case, an employee inherits from a person, and a person inherits from an object. The templating framework is smart enough so that if it doesn't find an employee template, it'll fall back to finding a person template. And if you really want to go crazy, you can create an object template, and that's what's going to be applied to everything. So that's kind of like creating a default template for everything in the world. So let me show you how that works. So in this case, I've created a person template, right here. So that's the only thing that the template helper knows about. But if you actually look at the controller, I'm actually returning an engineer, a software engineer. But because a software engineer in my hierarchy actually inherits from an employee, which inherits from a person, it'll go ahead and use the person template, even though I'm returning a software engineer. In other words, it's following the inheritance hierarchy to figure out what to display. Boom. There's my person template, even though I'm showing a software engineer. So that all just works. All right, so I want to talk about some of the other new features that I really don't have time to go into in depth, but I wanted to mention that they're there. We've made a lot of improvements to security. So one of the things that we've done is we've introduced this new notion of code nuggets. This is an ASP4 feature now. Now this is a little weird because, as I mentioned before, ASP.NET MVC is always compiled against 3.5, even if you're using it in Visual Studio 2010. But the interesting thing is the MVC framework is actually smart enough to detect whether it's running targeted against ASP4, and then it'll dynamically add code nuggets into it. So just to give you an explanation of what this code nuggets functionality allows you to do is normally if you just use the bracket %equal sign to display a value, there's no HTML encoding that happens, right? It just writes out whatever you have whenever you use bracket %equal sign. Now the danger there is, let's say someone posts something evil to your website, something that has some JavaScript inside of it that might steal people's passwords. That means you can end up creating a cross-site scripting attack or enabling a cross-site scripting attack. So what the new syntax does, the bracket %: does, is it automatically HTML encodes everything. And it's a suggested way now of, if you're using helper methods, to make sure everything's properly encoded. And again, this only works with MVC if you're using it targeting ASP.NET 4. It doesn't work if you're using with ASP.NET 3.5. The other change we made was to JSON results. So if you are using, this particularly affects jQuery developers. If you're using jQuery against MVC controller actions before, you could just call using a GET request against a controller action, and then you get the JSON response. We changed that for, again, because of security concerns, because there were certain attacks you could do, certain cross-site scripting attacks, where you can actually steal the data that way. So what we do is, by default, we disable GET requests, and we force you to actually think about it and turn it on now by setting a new property. So just be aware of that. We've made it as simple as possible, but we also don't want to do something insecure by default. We've also made some great performance improvements in general across MVC2. One area where we made big improvements was we used to have support for asynchronous controller actions, but only in futures, only in MVC futures. We've now moved that support from futures into the main framework. So asynchronous controller actions allow you to free up threads so that you can handle a larger number of requests more easily. Let's say that you have to do some long running operation in the background. By taking advantage of asynchronous controller actions, you can now do that. We've also made a number of what I consider convenience improvements. And the idea here is these are just, these are things that you could do before, but we just made them a little easier. For example, we've introduced default parameters, or default values for default parameter values now on controller actions. So you could do that before by just writing a little bit of code, by accepting a null value and checking for it. But now we've actually added an attribute they can add into a controller action parameter to give a default value if one wasn't specified. The other thing we did was, before, if you wanted to restrict which HTTP operations could be performed on a controller action, you would have to use the accept verbs attribute and actually pass in whether it could accept a post operation or a get operation or a put operation, whatever. Now we just made that simpler by creating a nice HTTP post attribute they can just put on things. And so it just saves you a little bit of typing, but overall, it's nice. Finally, value providers. Now, value providers are a little hard to explain, so I'm going to try to explain it anyway, and then I'm going to show you a demo. And so that should actually make it more clear than any explanation would. So let me start by trying to explain what a value provider does. What a value provider is the source that's used by a model binder when it's actually binding its data and instantiating the parameters used by controller action. So typically, if you're using a model binder, if you're using a model binder, what it does is there's some standard value providers in the MVC framework. It's going to look at the form collection, it's going to look at query string collection, the uploaded file collection, and that's it. So that's how it's going to find values when it's trying to instantiate parameters for controller action. Now what we've done is we've now made this model extensible so you can go ahead and create your own value providers. So I'm going to show you an example of this. This is actually a sample written by Phil Hack, a PM on the ASP.NET MVC team. He created something called a JSON value provider. And the idea there is if you're using MVC2 with ASP.NET AJAX, and please do that as much as possible, if you're using the two things together, you need some way to be able to, when you're posting JSON data back from, say, a controller action, you need some way to be able to grab values out of the JSON post and be able to instantiate that in your controller actions. So let me show you a demo of that. So I'm going to start by just running the page and showing you what it does. So this is a list of movies. And this is a grid. It's kind of hard to see on the slide up here, but those are a bunch of text boxes inside of a table. And this is actually using, in this case, ASP.NET AJAX and client-side code to create the grid. You can go through here, you can make a bunch of changes, blah, blah, blah. And when you click Save Changes, this is, again, using the ASP.NET AJAX library. It'll batch up those changes, send it back to a controller action, and inside the controller action, you can go ahead and save to the database. That's what I'm doing here. Save changes, changes saved. Just so you know, I'm not making all this stuff up. Let me go ahead and run it again. And notice it still says Star Wars 2, King Kong 2. So this changes are actually being saved here. So to get this to work, first let me show you how I initially display the grid. So here's my movie controller. And the movie controller has an action on it, a select action, that returns a JSON result. So it just says return JSON. And the nice thing about this action, the JSON result, is it will take anything you pass to it. In this case, I'm passing a generic list of movies. It'll automatically serialize it into JSON and return it. So that's all I had to do to expose it out to ASP.NET AJAX. And if you look at the view, I'm going to go to Views, you'll notice that all I have to do to invoke that method is I just give the name of the controller. And, well, this is the update method here. So I give the fetch operation down here. I say, go ahead and call the select method, and that returns a JSON result. And that's all I have to do to get inside the data view. I'm actually showing the text boxes down here. Here's my grid of text boxes. So that's all I had to do to show that grid. Now, the fancy thing here was when I actually wanted to update the data. Because normally, because the way that the ASP.NET AJAX library works is it passes back a blob of JSON back to the controller action. And normally, a model binder won't look at a blob of JSON to be able to figure out how to instantiate parameters. It just doesn't know how to do that. So what I did was, I didn't do it, Phil did. What Phil did was he created a JSON value provider. And what the JSON value provider does is it provides another source for the model binder to get its data from. So in this case, I created one for a movie change set. And you'll notice that this change set can now be passed into the controller action. Let me put a breakpoint right here. And so the blob of JSON that I create when I modify these guys is passed automatically to the change set. And this automatically represents what operation I want to do. I want to do an update on this movie, an update on this movie, and they can loop through and actually do the changes in the background. So taking advantage of value providers allows you to do interesting things like grab data from JSON. All right. So to summarize, MVC2, what we've done is we've concentrated on doing everything that we did right in MVC1 and doing more of it. So the main thing we've done is we've made sure that everything we've done allows you to build maintainable applications, and we've also concentrated on allowing you to be much more productive. So we've done more around separation of concerns. We've introduced a new render action method that works very much like, a render partial method, except it allows you to execute business logic. We've also created an areas feature, which allows you to create sub-applications within an overall, parent MVC application. We've done a lot of stuff around validation. We made validation a lot easier for you by allowing you to do everything in the model. And then when you have your validation defined in the model, it can bubble up to both the server side and the client side automatically. And finally, we've made some significant helper improvements. I like using strongly typed helpers because I don't have to resort to using strings for everything. And finally, templated helpers gives you a way to be much more productive when building an MVC application. So I should stop here and see if there's any questions about MVC2. Any questions about what we've done? Yes?
You said that validation gets pushed to the client. What about more complicated logic beyond just
Yeah.
require
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so the question, just to repeat, is, well, I showed some simple examples of validation being pushed to the client, but what if, in real life, validation rules get more complicated? And that's true. So the value provider stuff allows you to customize, what's put into the metadata pipeline that gets pushed up to the client, but we've also created an extensible model for our client validation framework on the client side to allow you to extend out the types of validation that you have to do. If you really need to do truly custom validation, you will have to write some JavaScript. There's no way around it. Yes?
What about data annotations? You were talking about that you can make your own provider for the validation stuff.
Yes.
But can you also provide data annotations in the broad sense? For instance, coming from a database or whatever. Let's say I want to provide another display name.
So the question is, can I customize the way that data annotations are created? Is that, I guess I'm not quite sure I understand.
Yeah, it's like you said, okay, you can do data annotations for validation, but you can also provide validations in another way.
Oh, yeah.
So just that going for the whole data annotation spectrum, for instance, display names, can I also provide those myself?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so the question is, can I customize the way that display names are actually pushed up to the client and pushed up through the whole system? Absolutely. So we have something we call a metadata pipeline, which allows you to, you specify, however you do it, you get it into the pipeline and then it's pushed up to the client side. And we have standard ways of representing things like, the label for things and so once you can get into the standard representation, then it's like, in an elevator up to the client side. So, yeah. Yes.
Template helpers, I expect you probably have already done this, but I'll ask it anyway. The parameterized by class that you're feeding in, which you want to render or perform. You also have the abilities to send through a context. Basically, I would expect I would want to be able to do a summary view, a row and a table, and I also want to do a detail view for an object.
Yeah, so that's a great question. The question is, what about more complicated scenarios of using the templated helpers where it's not just the type, or you don't want to be explicit, but it's the context where you're actually calling the templated helper method. So we don't have any built-in support, but you'd have to do some programming yourself to be able to do that. But you could definitely, you can override the way the templated helpers work and be able to display different templates depending on the context. That's true. Well, you're saying actually so what Rick was suggesting was putting in a UI hint for a property and using that to specify which template. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. So that way you can override for that particular property how it's going to be displayed. Oh, yes. Oh, that's a great question. So the question is, do the data annotation validators support localization? And absolutely they do. Yeah, they were designed to, actually they were written by a developer named Marchin. and he's very proud of, of his localization support. So yes, they do.
And as far as the display name property as well, forcing that in like a first name that's supply or in localization, supply first data how would you supply that?
So it's resource string driven. Rick, do you have more detail? It's resource. I believe there's actual properties on the data validation class where you can specify where that gets the resource strings, but you create the resx file and it'll do the alignment with that. Anything else? Oh, one last question. Yes.
Reuse validation. For example, you have an email that always needs to be validated in the same way.
Yeah.
Can you create a class that is like a wrapper for emails using that in your model, putting the validation once on the annotations of this email class, and then does that get pushed up to all the other? I don't know if you have a customer or
Oh, I see. So the question is, let me make sure I understand. Can you create like an email class and put the data annotation validators on it, and then use that email class, say, in a customer class, and have that be passed up as well? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the data annotation validators automatically float up to the client side, so you'll automatically get all the validation stuff on subclasses. All right. Well, thank you very much. You have questions?